Good morning and welcome to Eastertide, which, as we know, is celebrated in the midst of spring between our observance of Easter and the Ascension. And with spring for us comes the surging of new life, comes the perennial rebirth of the world that is around us. Today, even the earth cries out, nature mimicking the theological truths that we hold on to this time of year. Yet, as we know, the liturgical meaning of Easter has often been lost to more popular rites of spring. At the very least, churches tend to sugarcoat, or perhaps more aptly this time of year, as Ched Myers suggests, chocolate coat the Easter season, burying the resurrected Christ under candy, eggs, and bunnies. For those of us who follow in the footsteps of the executed Christ, our greatest omnipresent temptation continues to be conflating the Easter story, God's power over death, with the way of empire. This has always been our struggle. In the first century, Christians stubbornly clung hold to their belief in the resurrection of Jesus, while at the same time living under the chilling shadow of an empire that worship the ways of domination and death. It is a challenge that we understand well, because for centuries, people of faith have attempted to celebrate resurrection even while living in the clutch of empire. In fact, in these moments resting on the margins, our faith has the opportunity to thrive, and Easter time in particular continues to invite followers of Jesus to confront the powers of death. It's a call that churches have largely ignored this time of year, as was perhaps most evident by their silence and outright venom last Thursday during the execution of Liddell Lee, a likely innocent man who, like Christ, who they claim to follow, was murdered by a crowd of onlookers with his arms outstretched. So let me be clear that to worship the resurrected Christ on Sunday and applaud crucifixion on Thursday is not only ungodly but cowardly, morally depraved, and antithetical to the way of Christ. So this morning's question is a simple one. Do we recognize the Christ we claim to follow? In order to answer this question, we're going to revisit one of the church's most traditional Easter texts, Luke's account of the road to Emmaus, where an unrecognized Jesus converses with two obscure disciples. My understanding of this text has greatly been influenced by the theological and hermeneutical work of the author Ched Myers. It's no secret that his work is meaningful to me. I've quoted him from this pulpit often and don't see that changing anytime soon. This morning we are in the book of Luke, the 24th chapter. And for me, it seems that the danger of this text, and all biblical texts for that matter, is that when Jesus and his disciples become rootless, when they are neutralized from their societal issues and oppressions and their context, we begin to over-sentimentalize the text. We domesticate it and we strip it from all of its raw radicality. We chocolate coat the text. And that's what I'm afraid has happened to this particular story. So we're going to return to a story that gets preached a lot this time of year and see if we can't reclaim it a bit. At initial glance, this story, we notice a few things. A few things stand out immediately. First, the text occurs shortly after the women have discovered the empty tomb. So let us imagine these two disciples. Their leader charged a dissident and crucified by occupying powers. Some have suggested that perhaps this is not a leisurely walk, as we often imagine it. That rather these disciples are on the run, that they are hustling down a back road, that they're getting the hell out of Dodge, that they are fearful that they too might meet the fate of Christ. Where are they running to? The text tells us that their destination is the small and rather obscure village of Emmaus. It's not referenced anywhere else in the Scriptures. But historically, what we know about Emmaus is that the village had a reputation for homegrown resistance. So much so that the Roman Emperor Vespasian felt the need to turn Emmaus into a military colony. He occupied it with 800 Roman military veterans. So it's a place of resistance. It's a place of uprising that the empire has attempted to control. Our disciples, fleeing to the border, attempting to lay low for a while in this pocket of resistance. And as they do, perhaps even between panting breaths, they discuss all the things that have happened. That's what the text says, all the things that had happened. Jed Myers proposes that perhaps these two disciples were blaming each other for the mess they'd gotten into, wondering what their next move might be, lamenting Roman kangaroo justice, cursing the colonizers, even cursing Jesus for failing to deliver on his promises of a new social order. And in the wake of crucifixion, the disciples are likely grief-laden, scared stiff, and contentious. The verb that gets used in verses 4 and 15 for discuss is homphlein. Can you say that? Homphlein. You like how I pronounce that with such assurance? I have no idea if that's how you say it, but we're going to pretend that it's homphlein. And this word comes from the word that we get homiletics from. So the word refers to weighty matters, things that are weighty, which makes sense, right? These are weighty topics. They are discussing all the things that have happened, the arrest, the trial, and the execution of Jesus, perhaps too the parallel sufferings of other disciples. Yet there's another verb here, souzatine. We're just guessing on that one too, but we're going to say souzatine this morning. It's a word that's almost always used to connote a passionate dispute. They're disagreeing about something. Maybe they're arguing over what happened to the body. Perhaps their passionate, weighty dispute was about the best way forward, what it meant to resist amidst the shadow of death. And perhaps it was this intense and even desperate discussion that could explain why these disciples did not immediately recognize their teacher. Daniel Berrigan suggests another reason. Perhaps they don't know Christ because Christ was so beat up and disfigured by his torturers. Luke goes on to say that the scars of the risen Jesus were still visible. Talks about the scars in his hands. Resurrection isn't pretty. Does not wipe away all the darkness, the damage, and the trauma of empire. If you're looking for a magic cure, one that will strip away the past, the way of Christ is not that way. Though the scars do not have the final say, which is the message of Easter. We read this morning about the stranger who the disciples do not yet know as Jesus. And the stranger makes it clear that he has indeed walked into a heated debate of some type. He says, "What words were you throwing back and forth at each other while you were making your way?" And they looked gloomy. Cleopas' impatience is quite telling here. So you are the only one in Jerusalem who doesn't know what's been going down these last few days? Perhaps he's skeptical. They are, after all, fugitives on the run. Who is this unknown person asking prying questions? And how in the world could you not know what's been going on these last few days? Yet eventually he relents and passionately and a bit recklessly even launches into the whole sordid affair. How Jesus had been turned over to the authorities and crucified. How he had revived the prophetic tradition. How he had ignited hope in a people longing for shalom. How his leaders railroaded him, sold him out to the imperial oppressors, strung him up and lynched him. And finally, his frustration boils over. This is the punchline, so to speak. And we had trusted that he was the one to liberate us. You can almost sort of hear it in his voice, can't you? This bitter disappointment, this sense of betrayal, his confusion. We had so much hope, and yet. On Thursday night, I stood outside the governor's mansion for several hours. I took a small break to exchange some text messages with a friend, but most of the night found solace in the lighting of candles, hugs, and friendship of others. And as stay upon stay came down from the courts, we began to hope. Perhaps we may make it to midnight when the death warrant would expire. Perhaps. But at 11:56, Liddell Lee was pronounced dead. We had so much hope too, and yet. So it's easy to sympathize with Cleopas here. He'd staked his whole life on the hope that this movement would finally liberate his people from oppression. But things hadn't quite turned out that way. Jesus' march on Jerusalem hadn't resulted in the uprising that Cleopas and this other disciple were expecting. Instead, his leader had been publicly executed, and he quite possibly now fleeing for his life. Cleopas concludes his tale by addressing some rumors that have begun to circulate among his comrades, visions of angels and an empty tomb. To understand this scene, let us imagine for a moment a different day. April 6, 1968, Memphis, Tennessee. 2 days after King was gunned down by the powers. His comrades trying to figure out what had gone down, who was behind it, what it meant for the movement, whether they might be next on the hit list. For me, this encounter in Luke, like the one on April 6, 1968, must have been a traumatic one, to say the least. But even amidst all of this trauma, Jesus' response is quite telling. He doesn't scold them. He doesn't console them. He doesn't brush their experience under the rug. He just walks for a little while, walks for a few miles, inquires about their pain, listens, and even responds in a peculiar way. He points them back to the prophets. You fools, you who don't quite get it, you who have not yet found your way into the truth, you whose hearts are a little sluggish and heavy, you who are slow to believe the words of the prophets. And can we be honest with ourselves this morning? When have we not been slow to believe? When have we not applauded the rich while the prophets were telling us to defend the poor? When have we not become transfixed by the power of political and military might while the prophets remind us that revolution emerges from the bottom up and not the top down? When have we not idolized the work of our own hands when the prophets tell us to forego idolatry? And these disciples have forgotten the way of the prophets. Then, beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them the scriptures. That's what it says. The verb here means to translate into one's native tongue. Now, there's no reason to believe that they were actually speaking different languages. Perhaps Jesus is translating these counterintuitive teachings into the plainest possible terms he can, the prophets, so that even these demoralized and downtrodden disciples can get it. Myers puts it this way: these prophets are the ones who throughout the national history engaged the way things were with the vision of what could and should be. They question authority, make trouble, refuse to settle, interrupt business as usual, speak truth to power, give voice to the voiceless. They stir up the troops, get the natives restless. They picket presidential palaces. They question foreign policies based on military and economic domination and are accused of treason in times of national war making. That's the prophets. It seems to me that we could use a bit of prophetic peace in our own context, couldn't we? Yet, if this story ends with the stranger remaining a stranger, it doesn't have a lot of meaning for us. The first half of the Emmaus story, the risen Christ comes in the form of a stranger. But in the second half, he is revealed in the breaking of bread. That's a sermon all its own, and I won't preach it this morning, maybe another time. More articulate than the words he has spoken was the breaking of bread. Jesus, the one who violated the sanctimonious taboos of his day to eat with sinners and tax collectors, the one accused of being a glutton, is known here once again in the breaking of bread. It closes with this. When Jesus disappears, the two disciples explain, "Were our hearts not burning within us while he was talking with us on the road? While he was opening the scriptures to us." The verb open up, to open up. appears in the Gospels a few other times. In Mark 7:34-35, it refers to the opening up of deaf ears. In Luke 2:23, it's the opening of a closed womb. In Luke 24:31, it refers to the opening of blind eyes. And in Acts 16:14, to the opening of a hardened heart. Likewise, this text invites us to open our own blind ears, or blind eyes, deaf ears, and hard hearts to the difficult truth of discipleship under the shadow of death, and renew our commitment to the way of peace. These fugitive disciples end their encounter by returning to the capital city. They go on to share their experience with others' disciples before Jesus appears again to the whole group. So that's introduction. How about a sermon? Right? Laid a little groundwork. We ready for a sermon? All right, so what can we learn from the road to Emmaus story? I want to leave us with two thoughts. One, Christ first appears in the form of one who needs hospitality. It is the disciples who beg the stranger to eat with them, not the other way around. Number two, the way of Christ is both pastoral, seeking to know the pain of those struggling with a specifically political context, while at the same time being deeply prophetic. His biblical analysis centering around a fierce prophetic hermeneutic. Let it be so among us. Amen.